Do we have a problem with the world becoming older? That the average age of the world is becoming, that we have too many old people, that in decades ahead the ratio between old people and young people that have to support them is going to go in the wrong direction?
We do. We hear that, especially from countries like Japan, and we know that some countries in Europe in recent decades have really begun to struggle with what this will look like in the coming decades. And I think it is a problem. I think it's something that we have to pay attention to and be prepared to respond to with policy. I think what's also happening that doesn't get as much attention, though, is the number of young people that we have. Right now on the planet, more than half of the population is under the age of 25. That's an incredibly youthful population. So to think about the aging countries, yes, an interesting set of policy and social challenges there. The countries will be relatively well equipped to take on, but it's the youthful populations. That rapid population growth is happening in places that are often under-equipped to meet the challenge.
Where are we growing faster? In which parts of the planet is population expanding, growing at the fastest pace?
Well, we see countries in Africa especially, Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia, countries where their population might double in the next few decades. Afghanistan is another example of that. And so if you think about, the United States with 230 odd million doubling in the next few decades, how do you provide schools, sufficient hospitals, infrastructure with roads? I mean, if you begin to think of the problem in your own context, that kind of rapid population growth poses enormous challenges to governments.
And governments are also challenged in some countries because the population is dwindling, right?
Sure.
Give me an example about that.
Well, I think we see it. I think Japan is the story that probably most are familiar with. And those governments then are challenged by the notion of not having enough productive, sort of workforce, those within the kind of economic producing bracket. And some of those countries do institute policies, pronatalist policies, where women and their families are rewarded or incentivized to have more children. And that's one approach. But again, I think that's happening in far fewer places in the world than a growing population of youthful people is.
One of the most common examples of a policy which a government takes very strong action is China's one-child-only policy.
Right.
What do you think about that situation in China, about the one child per couple?
I think the first and most important thing to say about it is it's a gross and unnecessary violation of human rights, plain and simple. I also think that fertility in China, as many people don't realize, was already on the decline when they implemented a one-child policy. So I go back to instances where if you give women the tools, if you give families access to the services they need to plan their families, have kids when they want them, have as many kids as they want, in fact, families make the right decisions for themselves. And I think that's probably the most important message to have sent back to Chinese policymakers.
As you travel, because of your job, you travel around the world, you talk to governments, you see different experiences. Tell us, what are the most common mistakes that government make in the population area?
Well, coming from Washington, D.C., it's always interesting. We see this problem happening here, and it's this gross disconnect between the needs and wants of the people and the decisions of policymakers. A disconnect that doesn't have to happen. Where population is concerned, family planning is incredibly cost effective. It's low tech. It's easy to make available throughout countries, throughout really rural populations. And yet we find that governments aren't connected to the needs and desires of their citizens. And I think that's turning a deaf ear to social programs and to livelihood programs is probably the biggest mistake.
What you're saying is that everything indicates that women and families want to have less children and want to have the option of having less children,
right,
but that the governments are not recognizing that demand. Is that a fair
That's
synthesis?
it. Yes, there's right now 200 million women worldwide, just today, who would say they would like to delay or space their families differently. And they don't have access to the contraception that we take for granted in many parts of the world.
A lot of people, when population and family planning is mentioned, when you say family planning and population issues, Planned Parenthood and all that, what they hear is abortion. Are we talking about abortion here?
We are, to the degree that it's part of a comprehensive set of services. I think the important thing about abortion in a place like the U.S., where it's so politicized and such a polarizing issue, is that you can be supportive of family planning and not supportive of abortion, because family planning reduces the incidence of. What we're trying to do is give women the tools they need so they don't have to resort to unsafe solutions. Abortion, where it's safe and legal, it should always be provided as a method of reproductive health.
And in Latin America, where is the trend? Are more countries, is the environment more liberal, more tolerant of abortion, or is different countries are moving in the direction of restricting and criminalizing abortion? Which way is the trend?
For the Latin American region, I think among governments you see the latter. You see a more restrictive trend. But among the general population, you'd be surprised that you see a very progressive trend. Even among Catholics. I was raised Catholic in South Texas. And even though Catholics are not always supportive of the abortion issue, almost every Catholic uses family planning in his or her private life. And so that's the disconnect again between the reality of people's lives on the ground and decisions that are made in sort of cloistered hallways.
Speaking of reality, of the realities of people on the ground, again, because you travel all over the world and see examples both of governments in action, but you also see the women that are very often the victims of a very bad situation or a bad convergence of circumstances.
Right.
Share with us an example of a woman that you have met in one of your travels that stayed with you that illustrates the kinds of things we're talking about.
Well, I think of a woman named Aragesh in Ethiopia. I'm 38, she's 32. She has 6 children. Her husband works away from home. The land no longer produces what it used to, she says, so he's seeking employment elsewhere. She's left at home in rural Ethiopia, managing a household with 6 kids, limited education, and farmland that she's inherited from her father and her mother. And in the meantime, spare time, whichever spare time she has, she's a volunteer coordinator at a family planning clinic. I mean, what an extraordinary testimony that is, that in the minute a day that Aragesh has to breathe for herself, she's taking the good news that she discovered, she says, too late in her life, to other women and their families to help them have the possibility of a brighter future, perhaps.
And so when you have that perspective of that wonderful example, and you also have the perspective of governments that, as you say, don't hear the demands of the people for what they want and impose policies that perhaps are not what they are demanding. So you think ahead, and you have 2 beautiful daughters. In what way is the world in which your daughters are going to live fundamentally different than the world that you have known?
It's always such a good thing to be asked to think about your daughters. Paloma and Dahlia, the world they inherit. A couple of things. I mean, I hope the question you asked about trends, I hope that the answer for them is a totally positive trend. Positive in the social sector, that governments are more responsive to health, to education, to the entire suite of social services that people need to really maximize their possibility. I hope that's the norm more. In the environmental arena, I hope that people understand that comprehensive solutions are what's needed, that we have to work together to solve climate change, not just from a conservation perspective, but from a people's and livelihood perspective. And of course, because they're both young girls, I hope that the possibility of girls and women is more fully realized by the time they're adults. I hope that it's better understood what powerful agents of change women can be in the world.
I hope your predictions come to pass, and that's the kind of world we're going to be living in. Suzanne Ehlers, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Moises.